order to pay that debt. So I hope I make myself clear. Our primary focus is on the responsibility of the Kenya government for the way in which it contracts and manages debt, and to the Kenyan institutions, including the Kenyan Parliament, who has the responsibility of oversight and has a panoply of powers afforded to it by the new constitution to watch over how the government acquires and discharges its debts. And it is failing miserably. The Kenyan Parliament, you'll see in the course of our presentations, has failed to take its responsibility to represent the people who elected them and to hold the government to account. And as we see, we now have a broad-based government where the government has swallowed up the so-called opposition. So that means that we actually have very little protection from Parliament in terms of exercising its oversight power over how the executive implements its budgets and how it manages its debt. So I won't say very much more because we are late, and I'll give over the floor to Mwalimu to present his findings. Mwalimu Mati is a governance expert of long standing. He has worked in civil society in Kenya for longer than he'd care to admit, including at Transparency International Kenya, at the Public Law Institute. He founded Mars Group Kenya, which achieved some, I think many of you will remember some of its achievements. For example, when they pointed out that there was an error in the budget in 2009, and the government was forced to admit, yes, and they attributed it to a computer error. That occasion of these figures which had sneaked into the budget has never been clarified, as have other things never been clarified. But the work of civil society in uncovering this sort of malfeasance is really, really important, and Mwalimu and Mars Group Kenya did a lot of work in uncovering it. So we want to invite him to the podium. Thank you very much, Mwalimu. You have the floor.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me. I haven't done a presentation for quite a long time, so you bear with me if I stumble as I proceed. But thank you for coming to this report presentation. I am the author, and to that extent all errors are mine. So I think we can proceed. Now the title is Kenya's Debt Treadmill. As Gladwell said, it's not going to be limited to this particular creditor, which is China, but we thought that it would be a good start because China is the largest bilateral single creditor. So let's just start with some basic statistics or facts. We owe externally and domestically about 10.5 trillion shillings as of June this year. Almost half of that is external. So 49% is from external lenders. We're talking about 5.4 trillion in the last Controller of Budget report. 51% is from domestic lenders. Now this will go up and down. I think in the next couple of years we're going to see domestic bonds which have been outstanding for quite a while coming due, so you might see that we will pay those off and the foreign debt will rise. But it's basically a 50-50 split. Our public debt is rising year on year. So in the last financial year, Treasury reports that the increase was at 3%. This amounted to about 500 billion shillings. So from the time that William Ruto took over to date, he has had to borrow, and we will see that in the last year alone, he's taken about 36 loans. 36 loans for about 800 billion shillings. A lot of this is borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. But my concern, or our concern, is that public debt is consuming over 40% of all government expenditure. So of all the money that's available, sorry, I have to switch off my phone, apparently it's causing feedback, and yet that was my timer. Hoping to use it as a timer. I notice I'm already 3 minutes in and I haven't even gotten past slide 1. So public debt consumes over 40% of all money available for government expenditure. Next slide. Debt repayments are fairly high. We're talking about paying actual expenditure on public debt was 1.6 trillion shillings last year, up 500 billion from the year before. Foreign debt expenditure alone is 800 billion shillings in this year. I think we can go to the next slide. So I think we get into a discussion of who have we been borrowing from. So we have a slide there. I'm sorry it's a bit blurry, but where are our foreign creditors from? Well, about 2.5 trillion shillings is owed to multilateral banks. 1.37 trillion is owed to commercial banks. 880 billion is owed to China. China being the orange on the circle. And then you have smaller amounts owed to European governments, Japan, the United States, and several smaller debts from Brazil, India, Korea, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi. Now, the source of this information is the debt register, an annual document that's placed in Parliament. I think I might have to. This annual document, the debt register that's placed in Parliament, is an important document. It is, I think, colloquially called a register. But you see, with a register, once an entry is made, it cannot be removed. A register is a single document that is not edited. Now, what's been happening for decades is that Parliament is given extracts from the debt register in a form which is obviously an Excel sheet. So debts are sometimes in, debts are sometimes out. Details are sometimes in, details are sometimes omitted. Information disappears and reappears. So we're not sure in Kenya, is the point, that all loans that should be listed are listed, that all the loan terms detailed are accurate, and we're not even sure that there are loans that are listed but should not be. For example, fictitious debt. It's quite possible that there could be insertions. So what use is this document to Parliament and the people? Is it a current or an historical document? Is it really a register, is the question. And there are cost implications for errors in this document. So our argument is that it is time to start scrutinize the process of sovereign debt acquisition and to urge Parliament to insist on seeing the actual register. Let's go to the next slide. National revenue, all the combined revenue of taxes and even loans form the consolidated fund. That's the income of government. That's what we'll call national revenue. Now, every year, or at least as of today, 22% of all national revenue is immediately paid out to foreign lenders. You remember that our constitution requires that foreign debt be treated as a first and direct charge on the consolidated fund, in that it is the first expenditure before you pay any other, before you pay for development, before you do the transfers to the counties, Before you even pay our own constitutional officers, foreign debtors must be paid. So 22% is sort of ring-fenced at this point. The slide will compare that figure to GDP. Interest payments alone were 10% of government revenue, equivalent to 1.4% of GDP. Principal repayments in the same year amounted to 12% of revenue, 1.8% of GDP. And last year, foreign debt repayments were greater than the total amount of money spent on development expenditure by all the ministries and departments and agencies of the national government, and all the money transferred to the counties combined. So this is a big issue. Next slide. This slide basically shows you all the items of government expenditure, and you will see it in the report, so I won't go through it, but highlighted is that the three highlighted sections make that same point that I made. That's the combined transfers to the county governments and all the development expenditure is less than the consolidated fund services foreign debt expenditure. Let's get into the next slide. Who do we owe, how much do we owe, and for what do we owe? Let's move on. Now, the blue section to the right of that chart is multilateral development banks. So just under half of our debt is owed to the MLBs. MLBs are the World Bank, the African Development Bank, etc. Commercial bank loans, and this has increased in the last 2 decades, are now 23% of all our foreign debt. It's actually greater than bilateral loans, and bilateral loans tend to be concessionary. Now, we'll get to this later when we're looking at the China portfolio, but the majority of China's bilateral engagement with us is actually commercial from the Exim Bank of China. But bilateral loans are the smaller part, 21%. Now, we had said that we have over 5.5 trillion shillings of foreign debt. Tijan, just number one creditor, next slide, is the World Bank, and you'll see that at the top. Number two creditor, at present, correct as of the end of financial year 2023-2024, is the Exim Bank of China. Then you have, very interesting, you see number 3 and 4, Citigroup Global Markets, etc. Those are Eurobonds. So that's what's happening here. Then you get back into the IMF, which has come into the picture to bail us out of commercial debt. The African Development Bank is a big new entrant in infrastructure. The former PTA Bank, which is now called the Trade and Development Bank, is also lending quite a bit of money to Kenya for expenditure. But if you look at everything from Japan coming down, the amounts are fairly negligible. So we are highly exposed to a relatively small number of creditors. And apart from the IDA and the IMF, all of that is commercial. That's commercial debt. Next slide. As Gladwell said, one of the impetuses for getting involved in this new report writing was that we were, watching the news, reading the newspapers, and the annual forum on China-Africa cooperation was going on, and we noticed that the Kenyan press was full of stories like there's going to be a bonanza of goodies coming out of this. So we got a bit concerned because we're saying, there is nothing wrong with China-Africa cooperation, but it's highly unusual for a country in debt distress to have a media that's cheerleading the executive, and the executive actually putting out press releases talking about more and more borrowing, and yet we have all these incomplete projects. And lo and behold, as it turned out, they didn't get much in the way of all the things that they had hoped to. Rather, what happened was that they only got 2 new credit agreements. the 2 new credit agreements with the China Development Bank are first and foremost to fund the completion of 16 roads, which had already been financed by China, but at some point we had stopped paying contractors and work had stopped. So that money is a new loan to basically complete projects that had been fully financed in the first place. So, you've got the Kenyan problem of eating project funds coming back to bite us. So we take another 36 billion shillings to finish already financed roads. And then we say, well, we've got all these rural roads that we want to do. So we got funding for another 16 roads for a similar amount, about 36 billion shillings. So in effect, Kenya is borrowing a second time for the same roads. And at the time of writing, the report, I looked on the Treasury website to find out what are these roads. And there is no list there. If you go to the ministry, well, what used to be called the Ministry of Works, the Ministry of Roads, I suppose, there are some sort of web pages which will talk about all these roads that they want to do. But there is nowhere where you will find it said that the 36 billion shillings that we got out of FOCAC is for these particular roads, and this is the particular amount of money to be spent on them, and project start and completion dates. There is no such information. So here we've got a situation where we've got debt taken, signed off, but the public has no real information about what it's for. Tita, next slide. Now, this is just to show you the scale of the ambition of President Ruto before he had gone to Beijing. He actually wanted funding for these 4 projects. Now, the Rironi Mao Summit Malaba dual carriageway had already been allocated, again without parliamentary discussion and without much debate, to a French firm. So the French firm's financing didn't come through, it is said, by the government, or rather they wanted to cancel the contract because it had been signed in the late years of Uhuru Kenyatta, and so there are some people who like to have their own contractors. Galana Kulanu irrigation project, if you know, this one is in Tana River. This is an actual loan to Kenya from an Israeli bank, Bank Leumi. Now, Bank Leumi is on our debt register. We must repay that loan, but we kicked off the Israeli contractor. So this now is supposed to be transferred to a Chinese firm. There's a plan to turn Bomas of Kenya into an international conference center. That's a new project. But here you have a very ambitious expansion of the SGR into the region. Now, we all know that Uganda is no longer interested in that project. So which region are they talking about? But these were unfulfilled. But this shows you the executive's appetite for credit is basically insatiable. Now, as we know, when you borrow, you're basically deferring taxes, deferring the use of your taxes until another time and to a future generation. I mean, it's this kind of behavior that I believe underpins some of the great anger and justified anger of the Gen Z. Now, just wanted to note, next slide, that the report contains a complete list of Chinese loans taken from 2001 to the last reporting, which is the end of 2023. Now, that I think you'll be able to scrutinize at your own time. But it's an extract, well, this is actually a reproduction of what Parliament gets in the form of the debt register. Now, what do we get for any loan? And one would say for these particular Chinese loans. As with any other creditor, what Kenya ought to get, but what Kenya has gotten from China, is rapidly built expansive infrastructure projects. I would say that there is no doubt that Chinese projects are generally delivered quite well. But what we give China in return is interest on a loan, and there's no quarrel with that, so long as the loans are negotiated at the best rates and construction is of the best standards for the price. But the problem is that China and Kenya agreed to keep the terms of these loans confidential. We have a big quarrel with that. Now, FOCAC, if you read the Beijing Declaration, shows that there are other conditions that are attached to these relationships. We're all very familiar with the World Bank and the IMF and their policy conditionalities. So China too exacts policy conditionalities, but mostly in foreign policy. So Kenya, like all other attendees at FOCAC, made commitments to China, for example, that it would support the One China policy. And this is one that worries us in civil society. Kenya will oppose, quote, politicization of the human rights agenda and politicization of the United Nations Human Rights Council and its relevant mechanisms. So I'm not sure that we saw that in the recent released Kenya foreign policy, but these are the quid pro quos that come when you have heavy exposure to foreign creditors. Now, finally, we've basically agreed, and again, this isn't contentious, because we have the World Bank office in Nairibi, that the China Development Bank will set up, I think, one of its first big Africa offices in Kenya. It has been here since 2018, but it has now been agreed to set up a full lending bank office. Next slide, please. Wanted to compare, is it growing? Is Kenya's debt to Kenya growing? Kenya's debt to China growing? So what can we learn from this slide? Well, for one thing, from 2018, you'll notice that the SGR loan balance is actually growing. If you look at the table or chart on the right, you'll see that the one on the left is 2018, the one on the right is 2023. The standard gauge railway in 2018 was the second largest Chinese loan, but by 2023 it is the largest loan. But one would expect that loans which are being serviced should have reducing balances, so exposure, because this is amounts outstanding. But what I found, which is explained in the report, is that a couple of months ago, the Treasury published a report that the Kenya Railways Corporation has defaulted on its SGR loan from the Treasury. So what's been happening is the Treasury has been making payments to China on the SGR loan, but it had on lent, in other words, it's taken up the burden for the Kenya Railways Corporation. Now, Kenya Railways at present has arrears of over 1.67 billion, over $1 billion. Now, there are some very serious implications arising from this. I'd advise you to read page 17 and 18 of the report for details. But what it concerns is the Kenya Ports Authority and essentially Kilindini Harbour. Go to the next slide, please. Overall, these are the active loans from China today. The portfolio consists largely of roads, 1.78 trillion shillings of principal debt. So that's greater than the SGR, which is about 700 billion shillings. Now, the declared debt for, or the publicly known debt for SGR, and that which is present in the debt register, is actually about half that 700 billion shillings. But that's another story that we'll get into as we go along. We have heavy lending, just under $500 billion to power, electricity sector. We have water supply loans, telecommunication. About 40 billion is to directly fund acquisitions from China as buyer's credits. They've also funded the health sector, solar projects, And all of these you will find described in the report. The mining sector, national youth surveys, tertiary education. But again, I'd invite you, when you read the report, to look at the section where we're discussing opaque loans. So these loans are all there, and well and good. They've been declared to Parliament, but we don't actually know what their status is or what they are really for. So, for example, I'll just go into the report to give you one example. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I think I should have. Yes. So there are three examples of fairly opaque loans with loan terms not clearly they're not disclosed, and so it's not very clear how the general public who are going to repay these loans will deal with these issues. One is a very interesting project. The whole plan was to do a remote sensing geophysical survey of Kenya, particularly to identify mineral resources. And this was to be a four-year loan whose terms are not public, but which was said to be about 5 billion shillings. It was signed with Exim Bank of China in August 2017. Now, open source research reveals that its purpose was to undertake this remote sensing for identification of mineral resources. I understand that the project didn't happen, but the loan remains on our books. In other words, this survey apparently was done by, perhaps I think, the Americans, but we still have a loan on our books. The second strange project to me, actually, we're actually in Kileleshwa, or Lavington, and there's a project for the construction of an underground electric power network. So the cabling, they want to remove the overhead cables and run it underground. This was signed in May 2017, an 8 billion shilling project, no details, except where it is to take place: Kileleshwa, Westlands, Parklands, Ngara, and Riverside. There's a second one for Kilimani, Hurlingham, Gom Road, State House, and Lavington. 2 loans, totaling about almost 200 billion. But has any of you, as you drive around Kileleshwa, actually seen any frenetic activity laying underground cables?
Kenya Power is currently cutting down trees that are encroaching on power.
That's right. So this is our beef. We can't ask taxpayers to just continue to allow Parliament to remain silent about these inconsistencies, because these documents are in Parliament. But I don't see too many MPs saying, and they also live in these areas. In fact, our former president and the current president both live in the State House area. Surely they should be concerned, but we know what's up. Now, I'm trying to move on quickly. I think I've run out of time. Yes, please. There are 3 types, next slide, 3 types of Chinese credit lines. So Exim Bank, China Development Bank, and the government. Exim Bank, you'll see in the report and on that slide, is the longer column. Now, China's earliest loans were issued in the 1980s. They financed, for example, work on the Nyayo and Kasarani sports stadia. But those were like very long-term loans. I think they were 20 to 30 years, and they were free of interest. But those all came from the government of China. Exim Bank becomes a player in Kenya, next slide, when Jubilee takes over. So before Jubilee took office in 2013, our loan portfolio to China was fairly small, no more than 2.5% of total public debt, or 5% of the foreign creditors. But Uhuru went on a look east policy. He personally visited China many times in his first years, And during his first term, Chinese loans grew from $600 million US to over $4.5 billion, all on commercial terms. In his second term alone, in his first term, it rose to that $4.5 billion. In the second term, he added another $2 billion. Now, by the time he left office, we're basically talking about 22 cents of every Kenyan shilling borrowed was owed to a Chinese entity. Today, that figure is about 16 cents, which is 16%. Although President Ruto has attempted he had stated that it was his policy intention to renegotiate or reschedule. China is a member of the Paris Club, and they have a very clear rule against blanket sort of debt forgiveness, and particularly they don't want to prefer any creditor or disadvantage any creditor against vis-a-vis the other. And China told Kenya in FOCAC that it's against, it'll only do a case-by-case debt treatment of African countries. Next slide. I think you've seen this animation, but if Tijan takes you through it, no, not the animation, just change, the slide, no, next slide, yeah. Click, yeah. So in 2008, after the post-election violence, we formed the National Accord Government, which basically brought the opposition into parliament, and Uhuru Kenyatta, who had supported Kibaki and had defected from the opposition, became the finance minister. Next slide. It's in 2010 that the first Chinese commercial loans come into effect. In 2010, we started about $150 million. I understand that the Chinese had always seen Kenyatta as a potential president and did want to support him when he was Minister of Finance. So to that extent, he was able to get quite a lot of deals going. Next slide, 2013. Click again. 2013 is about the time, or is contemporaneous with the first year of the Belt and Road Initiative. China's aid flow to Kenya doubled. And it's at that point that we also saw Kenyatta's National Alliance Party seeking to twin itself with the Chinese Communist Party. Railways, roads, bridges, airports, stadiums, universal education, and healthcare were all contemplated to be funded with Chinese debt. Go to 2016. By 2016, we're talking about $4 billion in, and by the end of the first term, $5.5 billion. And that's when you started to hear people talking about debt trap diplomacy. Next slide, please. And by 2019, China has overtaken all other bilateral creditors and is matching, and in some years between 2019 and 2023, overtaking temporarily the World Bank Group as the largest creditor. Tijan, next slide. Okay, next slide, please. Let's take the case of the SGR, because we want to answer the question of what do we really know about Chinese loans. In September 2022, then Transport Minister Kipchumba Murkomen posted two of the SGR contracts between Kenya and Exim Bank on his Twitter account one Sunday evening. The contracts were worth about $3.2 billion, but they were only for the first phase, Mombasa, Nairibi. And also recall that the SGR does not actually begin in Mombasa. Neither does it actually terminate in Nairobi. It begins in a place called Meritini, and terminates in Machakos County, in Syokimau. Now, but Murkomen left out 2 other loans worth $1.5 billion more. Those have never been published. They were to build the new inland container depot, which was built in Nairobi's Embakasi, and the 120-kilometer SGR extension to Dukamoja, outside Naivasha, or outside Suswa. Also left out were the actual construction contracts, which should reveal the actual bill of quantities and costs for the railway line and all its associated infrastructure. That's the railway stations that you see up and down the SGR, and all the associated costs. In other words, we have never been told for sure, and we've never seen the contracts for the SGR. Now, the Kenyan government has always maintained that it is bound to keep, as a term of the contract, secrecy and confidentiality. But we argue that there cannot be secrecy or confidentiality from the principals. That's the Kenyan people, the taxpayer. The contracts that were published by Murkomen, and you read them, actually said that this obligation to conceal was to have effect, quote unquote, in perpetuity. I found that fairly strange. In perpetuity, until heaven comes. This is kind of outrageous. But the parliament, I think, stands indicted on this. They, never really interrogated those contracts. The only investigations of the SGR contracts were done at a public hearing before a parliamentary committee in 2014, where copies of the contracts were tabled, but they disappeared fairly rapidly. I think they were collected and taken away, such that years later, I remember somebody telling me that MPs were basically asking them for copies of these contracts. And even when these contracts were tabled in court, judicial decisions said that they had been obtained by theft. That was in the case of now Senator Mtata's challenge to the SGR. The documents were expunged from the court records and his case was dismissed. Next slide, please, Tijan. The Constitution, I believe, and the law, and I think Wachira, when he comes in, will talk to us about fiscal constitutionalism, requires prior knowledge. Indeed, as you'll later see, this was one of the demands of Kenyans of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. I know that that cannot be referred to as a source of law, but it was essentially a referendum on the principles of how debt should be acquired. Now, Parliament should know before, and Parliament should only authorize the borrowing of money for projects which are budgeted for, or which are in the already approved budget. So this is the PFMA Act. We'll see later that this has been monkey-wrenched a bit. Next slide. As Gladwell indicated in her opening remarks, there are very many, there's a great panoply of powers that Parliament has. So I would direct you to consider Article 211, which is discussed in the report. But, next slide, please. But critically, Parliament is meant to know the use that the loans are to be made of prospectively. If we just go back one slide, sorry, I had underlined Article 211 2b, the use made or to be made of the proceeds of the loan. So Parliament has the power to request by a resolution for the tabling of all information regarding loans. Have you seen the Budget Committee, the Finance Committee, calling for the documents or some sort of paper or explanation of the latest debts from the IMF or China? No. Next slide, please, Peter. Next slide, please. Now, that was the people wanted a priori or prior approval of debt, but this very long-winded slide basically argues that there was bureaucratic and political resistance to that idea. And at the end of the day, the borrowing approval of Parliament, now by convention, seems to be limited to approving the revenue estimates, but usually after whatever Treasury gives them, they'll approve the revenue estimates, which incorporate the annual borrowing plan of government, and limited to setting debt ceilings. And we've all seen how many times the debt ceiling has been increased over the last 5 years. But in the meantime, from the time that we promulgated the Constitution, loopholes were inserted in the Public Finance Management Act. Two additional conditions for the handling of foreign loan proceeds were added. The PFMA originally, let's go to the next slide and I'll show you. I don't know if you can read that, if it's possible to enlarge. The PFMA originally replicated the language of the Constitution. And so on the left, the old PFMA regulations. And this was about how or where proceeds of loans raised would be placed. And there are only two places you could put a foreign loan. That's into the consolidated fund or into a statutory fund established by the national government or by Parliament. Now, what they added were two other things. You need to scroll it here. They also allowed, in 2014, the law was amended, and this 2014, by the way, was just in the run-up to the Eurobond, to directly disburse loan proceeds to suppliers in the case of a so-called government-to-government loan, and in the case of commissions and transaction fees. Let's go to the next slide. Now, as all that happened, Parliament remained silent. Now, we think that, just go back one, just so that I can finish. We believe that the 2014 PFMA Act amendments create a loophole for abuse that we have seen in the case of the Eurobond, where the handling of foreign loan proceeds outside Kenya meant that the Auditor General and the Controller of Budget had no sight of the transactions. Similarly, many of the Exim Bank agreements will involve contractors based in China who are getting their payments directly from Exim Bank in China, again, outside the ambit or the purview of the Controller of Budget. This is a complaint that the Auditor General has publicly made, as has the Controller of Budget. Now, the Eurobond, in which over half the proceeds of the Eurobond never made it back to Kenya, is seen by many as the beginning of the treadmill of debt on which Kenya government is now trapped. Next slide, Tijan. I'm not sure whether I need to go over every detail of the Eurobond, but in essence, the Eurobond was initially intended to be taken as a means of testing Kenya's creditworthiness and to retire a syndicated loan that the Kibaki government had taken of about $600 million. By the time all our officials were done, the Eurobond was about $2 billion. So we borrowed over almost $1.5 billion more. And the problem is that the investors were told that it was to be used for infrastructure modernization, such as JKIA. Remember, this is 2014. JKIA, our rivals terminal, had just burnt down. So we go out, we raise money to rebuild the JKIA, and it was for power transmission lines. JKIA, power transmission lines, Adani, 10 years later, we're still flogging the same projects. None of what was proposed happened with the Eurobond funds. Now we are borrowing money from Abu Dhabi. This is part of the borrow from Peter to pay Paul scenario. $1.5 billion, 8.5% interest to pay domestic creditors. Next slide, please. So remember the panic we faced when we had to repay $2 billion for the Eurobond earlier this year? In 2031, Kenyans are going to be asked to pay $3 billion as a lump sum. Yeah? So we're talking about in 7 years, Gen Zs are going to have to come up with $3 billion. Plus, in the interim, because this loan is only for the next 8 years, they're going to have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, for what projects are these being taken? Well, we're told that it is to repay domestic bondholders. Now, the interesting thing is that the Cabinet Secretary, our current Cabinet Secretary, when he was being vetted, said that during the Declaration of Wealth discussion, he said that a substantial portion of his net worth is comprised of T-bills and bonds. So he's in an invidious position of conflict of interest, but I'm not sure that he even realizes it. So in conclusion, we need to just ask certain questions. With relation to China and with relation to all our foreign creditors, is our national debt properly authorized? Yeah? Are all the pet projects of the executive currently authorized by Parliament through the Appropriations Act and Finance Act? You know, so are they inserted in detail, knowing that the debt register itself should be incorporated into the budget so that you plan your budget based on your existing obligations before you start to assume new ones. Now, I'm not actually the best financial manager of my own personal affairs, but as a Kenyan, I think that we can demand higher standards of the government. So I think the report, once you get a copy, I hope we'll be able to explain in more detail some of the conclusions that we've been making in some of my presentation. I hope it will be useful to you in advocacy for better use of public funds. And I thank you so very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mwalimu. I think we'll all agree that that was a very informative and detailed presentation. I don't know if any of you know of anywhere else where that level of detail is available. And I want to thank you and commend you for the work that went into compiling all of this information for us. We are now moving into the second part of the program, where panelists will come and respond to Mwalimu's presentation. So I would like to ask the panelists to come forward and join us at the head table. And while we're doing that, I would ask the rest of you to please get some refreshments. Yeah? Well, of course, the panelists are also welcome to refreshments. So on your way to the table, please get some refreshments, and then we'll sit down and continue seamlessly. Some of us brought their own. Some foresighted individuals who probably manage their financial affairs better than some of us. Yeah, so I would ask you to come forward, and also please serve yourselves at the back. Thank you.
45 minutes, too long. It was supposed to be 30.
Yeah. Diana, you sit in the middle. Malimu, will you sit here or? Okay. You're live. Yes, everyone, we can reconvene. Okay, so I'll sit it with my. Okay, so George. Mama Lena. Okay, good. So, oh man, I don't have the program. So I'm glad to see there's such a vibrant discussion during the break, and I'm assuming that discussion was about this report. I've had some very good feedback from the public. What we'd like to emphasize is that this is just a first sort of exercise on this. We have limited resources, so we had to keep things small and didn't get as much dissemination as we would have liked to have. But we can certainly do this again, and do this again with our partners, and have a much broader, wider access for the public to have this kind of information, because we feel it's essential. I mean, people are searching for this information these days. It's not like, 10 years ago when we were sort of preaching in the wilderness about the importance of fiscal and financial accountability and constitutionalism. People are hungry for those kinds of details. So we're very happy that this information is finding a receptive audience and an appreciative one, and we'll do everything we can to expand our outreach and dissemination. So probably early in the new year we should, or early in next year, we should be able to do a repeat performance. Can I have a program, please? So the session we're going into now is going to involve responses from our friends and partners, who I already introduced earlier today and whose names are in the program, so I won't take time in going through this. But we will give each of you 10 minutes to respond to the report, to introduce yourself and respond to the report. What order would you like to go in? Because I haven't actually preset an order. Diana, would you like to go first? You cannot. Okay. Sure. Well, we wanted to give the woman the first right on what is otherwise, male-dominated. Okay. So I'll ask our friend Kwame Owino. He is known to all of you, I think. If you follow economic and financial affairs and also watch the news or TV, the Institute of Economic Affairs is Kenya's premier economic civil society think tank. They were one of the key governance organizations which was founded way back in, I think, the late 90s. Yeah. Oh, one of their directors is here. So you see people with pedigree here. The first CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and now under the able leadership of Kwame Owino, who will take us through his remarks for some 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Sorry? Okay. Good.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Gladwell, for the kind introduction.
From which media house may I ask? KTN, welcome KTN.
Is it ready?
So hope you be with us when we do this again on a bigger scale.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Gladwell, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much, Mwalimu, for putting together the report, which is the substance of our discussion today. Now, I have 10 minutes, so I'll make 5 points very, very quickly. So the first is, I think the report, if you look especially at the title, which is basically Kenya's debt treadmill, and then of course the Chinese portfolio, which is a separate question. But if you look at the question about the debt treadmill, Mwalimu, you've persuaded anybody who comes with an open mind that Kenya is on a debt treadmill. For what reason? If you think about a treadmill, I mean, it means you have to keep running, and sometimes faster, to stay in the same place. And if you looked at the last 10 years and the list that you've provided to us, it seems as if right now the Republic cannot afford not to borrow anymore just to keep finances where they are, just to maintain, I mean, to prevent the bottom from falling off. The borrowing has to come. And you're now borrowing from people with, I'd say, diverse reputations. That's my word. I mean, reputations of different kinds. You just have to borrow from everybody to keep everything running. And that's basically not only just on the external affairs part, on the foreign part as well. Government has to keep borrowing just to keep everything up. Suggesting to you that there's a breaking point, possibly, but what you're trying to do is just to prevent a collapse by keeping the pace. So you have to run faster to just stay on the block. So the question about the trading, I mean, the borrowing, whether it's from foreign sources, whether it's from private sources, whichever, government cannot do without any more money to keep the same cycle going on. So I think on the basis of that treadmill, it's an apt metaphor, I mean, analogy, and obviously useful. The second thing that the report tells you is, let's ask ourselves, you don't go on a treadmill and start to borrow in billions of shillings from everyone, unless something went wrong. And fundamentally, in our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs, perhaps some of the panelists would agree, is there's a serious constitutional error. And more specifically, Article 211, A and B, which of course talks about how Parliament which has exclusive rights to procurement of debt in our definition, because that's spending powers and taxation powers. So debt presents today's expenditure, which is future taxation. So both of those, in our view, is still, if you read Chapter 12 of the Constitution, Parliament's authority. And as you've told us about the suckers of borrowing one way or the other, transparency, records that are incomplete, on the whole, suggests that Parliament has not taken seriously its Article 211 and has not read in the most expansive way what the prescriptions of Article 211 intended to be done. So what still happens is basically Parliament blinks whenever the Treasury says, look, it is not necessary for us to disclose this, or whenever it is presented with incomplete records and is unprepared to do the difficult work that is required, in our view, to ensure that the fiscus is properly balanced, which is the responsibility that they have. So they tend to trust the Treasury or the executive too much, and to take the view that because of the constitutional order that preceded what we have, the antecedent, Treasury had a monopoly on economic policy. That new constitution in 2011 gave responsibility under Chapter 12 to Parliament, and Parliament is unwilling to wield it and use it properly. And of course, that culminates in what you see as Article 211 and the deficits there. The third question is on, I think Mwalimu has presented a fantastic, a meticulous assembly of data with lists about who's owed in terms of all external debt, but then obviously the top 10 largest loans to the Chinese. I have 2 points that I'll make. One is a debater's point, which is I am not persuaded that there's a big grand strategy called the debt trap by the Chinese. I just think that what happens is, in 2008, something happened globally, which was, after the great financial crisis, interest rates in certain parts of the world, more specifically in developed and high-income economies, dropped precipitously. I mean, really, really, really low. For that reason, people were searching for yield, investment arm of banks and all that. So private capital then became available. Countries such as Kenya coming to the fore, justifying it for both political and big reasons such as Vision 2030, decided to open up the taps to try and borrow. And the Chinese were there as well. So borrowing became available on cheap terms, and that's why this question about sovereign debt and debt rating as a way of ensuring that private capital would open up to developing countries became. And I think under the guise of that Africa rising narrative, a dangerous narrative that has taken African countries into the rabbit hole, was adopted. So certain conditions globally which nobody had seen were captured, especially by fast-talking people in the Treasury. Started talking about debt rating as if that's some new thing. We started to talk about the standard gauge railway and how infrastructure and the infrastructure gap, all these things, which is new language for things that have always been spoken about. And then therefore a loading of debt happened. And remember, the loading of debt was not only external, it was also domestic. So people just opened up to a glut and to actually gluttony rather, in terms of debt and huge public spending. And you see huge fiscal expansion taking place around 2014, really, really aggressive fiscal expansion. And anybody who's a sober person, who's ever had to tell a child or to tell any other person, look, we are closing the pantry door, there's no more candy. Anybody who has that level of sense in 2016 knew Kenya was in trouble. I don't think it was necessarily predetermined, or the Chinese, but once that debt appetite was satisfied, it was going to be, even if it wasn't Chinese debt, it was going to come to something else. So that's the first. The second myth is the question about, I think the other thing is, I think, Gladwell, as you spoke, you were much too kinder to the Chinese. So I don't agree that Kenya's debt problem is a Chinese problem. But when you have an appetite for debt, an avarice for debt, for just public spending, and the belief which was captured politically to persuade us that Kenya's development problem is that there's insufficient infrastructure, and therefore if you have shiny, swanky infrastructure, all growth will follow, it becomes very, very easy then to say stuff such as, look, let's borrow as much as we can. We're going to build things from SGR, all manner of things that were supposed to build a Silicon City and all those things that are supposed to be, because development is supposed to be big goods and especially brick and mortar. It's nonsense, but it's persuasive as well. And so then come the Chinese. Now that appetite was not created by them. But the character of Chinese lending, especially through its state banks, meeting an avarice for debt creates that toxic concoction which we are now talking about here, which is they tend to be non-transparent. They don't care what your constitutional obligations are and whether you violate them, which we think, with respect to the SGR, has been violated again and again. And therefore we have this. So it's a meeting of different. So the political economy of debt contracting in Kenya is something that I don't think some Chinese guys sat somewhere and conspired for, but says, look, if you guys want to hide information from your own citizens, we don't care, provided you pay us. And so that's what we have coming out here. So the overall transparency problem, and the fact that for China transparency is a suggestion, it matched the Kenya treasuries, and in this case actually I don't absolve Parliament, I mean both the executive and Parliament, their appetite and preference. And therefore they captured that to bypass parliamentary scrutiny. And Parliament accepted it. And why do I think Parliament accepted it? In the last 10 years, the debt ceiling, or what we call debt ceiling, which is a suggestion, completely useless as a policy instrument for managing debt, every time the Treasury came before Parliament and sought its expansion, it was done 7 times. So you have to ask yourself, what value is it if there is no controls around that area? So basically, if you think about it in that way, that comes as the issue. So we have a serious transparency problem. And if you look at Article 201 of the Constitution, which states the principles, and the transparency questions are reinforced again and again. Before you talked about intergenerational equity and the prudence that is required, we call them the prudence principles of public finance management. You cannot suggest that they've not been violated again and again. And I think a correction is due. How that happens, whether it's through the courts or whether it's through something very serious happening, is something that we don't wish to, but I mean, we don't wish for a crisis to generate it, but I think a discussion such as this lets us to do. And then finally, as I come to the tail end, the transparency problem in Kenya manifests itself in really, really interesting ways. And I think because the Parliament, by being persuaded that debt procurement is very technical and beyond their ken, have ceded that responsibility to the Treasury, which then, to the executive, which then tells them when and if. And what then happens is, Mwalimu has told us the 10 largest, or rather has placed on page 17, I think, the 10 largest Chinese loans in Kenya, after taking us through that database of 200. That's meticulous work. That in itself is very difficult. And that's what the Treasury likes. They dump that data because they know by the time you organize it and are able to extract insights, they already got the approvals that they wanted from Parliament, and they're gone. So you're dealing with it into the future. But I think there's something about it that tells us why we need to be committed to a public debt register, whatever we call it, or a database. One, I have sat in a room in which I had, no names mentioned, but I've sat in a room in which I had professionals from the African Development Bank stating that they have not asserted themselves enough such that Kenya's most, singularly successful infrastructure project in 2008 or 9, the Thika Highway, superhighway. So here is the fact. The fact is, it wasn't funded by the Chinese. The contractor was a Chinese person. But the payer and the person who held the liability, or rather was Kenya's partner, was actually the African Development Bank. But the absence of clarity around these issues makes Kenyans attribute it to the Chinese. So it was a contracting firm. So Mwalimu, we might have to go back there and actually ask what's the truth around this area. Because as I conclude, one of the things I'd like for us to do about public transparency on debt, we should have a single source of truth about who is owed, on what terms, the tenure of the loan, the coupon rate, if there are works and subsidiary arrangements which require for somebody to undertake. All those things should be available, and it should be a public database. A couple of years ago, the IEA played around with something about creating the equivalent of, well, this is what happens when you get an opportunity to go to New York and you see the public debt clock in New York and you say, this would be useful for Kenya. And our intention was to place it somewhere close to where all parliamentarians passed, so that as they pass, they can see it every day and recognize that is it. Right? Now, somebody, stole our idea, but they made it a technical one. It's available and it's running somewhere on somebody's X page. But because they didn't think about it, our view is actually to use public data to construct a public debt clock so that we can see, just like we have population clocks, on the minute what the legal obligation is per person. That does not happen until we have a cleaned debt register telling us all the items about what is owed, so that every month or every week or every so often we can issue a report like your bank issues to you on regular terms when you have borrowed. So we have a transparency problem. And of course, Monday morning quarterbacking is necessary. If more transparency had been available, if Parliament had insisted on it, and the rest of us actors had insisted on it, using Article 211 to activate it, perhaps Kenya's debt distress, even if it were to exist, would not be as serious as it is today. And then there's the big question which Mwalimu left about. The transparency problems that we have with the public debt problem on the external side manifest themselves and are reproduced on the domestic side as well. There's a dark hole there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kwame. There's so much in what you've said, but definitely the idea of us doing the best that we can with the information available to increase transparency to Kenyans around what we owe to whom and on what terms is definitely something that we need to pursue. I will now call on Diana Gishengo. This young lady is the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Accountability, which also engages on issues of fiscal accountability and on debt issues. I believe you are a leader of the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, which works on such issues, and she's going to give us her thoughts on the report, particularly concentrating around the challenges to civil society of dealing with debt issues. We've heard the challenges, particularly transparency issues and the difficulty of gathering information. But the challenges to civil society of confronting and dealing with debt issues in an atmosphere of the collapse of checks and balances, including Parliament, as we've heard, which has abdicated its duty. Thank you very much, Diana.
Thank you very much, Gladwell, and thank you very much, Mwalimu Mati, for coming back. It's good to see you. And then to come back in such a powerful way and bring us this report on, first, the treadmill. I agree with Kwame. We are on a treadmill that is running faster. You know, you can be on a treadmill and you're comfortable, right? You're jogging at a pace that your heart, your legs, your age can handle. I don't know what you call a treadmill. That you're there panting, waiting to die. I suspect that is where we are as a country. And then the Chinese debt problem. At TISA, and together with Muhuri, we went to court contesting the procurement of the SGR contract. And the Court of Appeal agreed that the procurement didn't meet both the requirements of the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act and our Constitution. But when we went to the Supreme Court, we were told everything was adhered to. And so we were like, okay, the highest court has ruled. We respect, but we do not accept. We went back and filed yet another constitutional petition demanding for the SGR contracts. That is still ongoing. So when Murkomen presented something that looked like contract, we were there wondering, it was supposed to be this easy. then a closer reading of Article 211 of the Constitution, that we've been in court for so long, there has been such an expansive public discussion on the SGR contract, yet Parliament within 7 days can get all these documents. Why are they not getting them? Who would be affected if these contracts were made public? Is it the Chinese? I highly doubt. Then Mwalimu Mati shocks us today with the conditionalities. Where are they? Please can you give us, because those ones we really need. I hope you heard of those conditionalities around the fact that Kenya cannot engage on issues of human rights and governance. We will not politicize the Human Rights Council. And now Kenya is a member. What does it mean when we take such loans? Yes, a 2% interest rate, zero transparency. I doubt it is maybe, I don't know whether it's a requirement of the Chinese, but we are in court for that. We are also in court for Eurobond contracts as well. And for that particular process, the court has postponed judgment 4 times. So I don't know whether there is no ink and paper, but there must be a reason why we are not able to get a ruling on contracts. And this becomes very linked to the issue of a register. Lately, Treasury has been very proud. Just go to our website, you will get anything you require. You go to the Treasury website, you will get entries and numbers. They have even moved a step further, and they give a summary of the project description. But that's still not adequate for us to act decisively on issues of transparency, accountability, and allow people to participate. And remember, it's a single entry, so that complicates it. Whenever we compare the data from Treasury, from the Controller of Budget, and from CBK on debt, rarely do we find congruence. And for the first time, the Auditor General has produced a report that shows huge disparities. For one contract in Sondumerio, the disparities in payment between what the Controller of Budget has, what Treasury has provided, is over 600 million. One contract. So if we are to audit all of them, the amount of fraud that you will find in debt is very, very, very high. Now, we are on a treadmill, we are about to collapse because our debt has been growing at a rate of 17.9% annually, average. For the last 10, 14 years, I will stay with 14 years. I'm happy there are people who are giving us a more historical account. I'll start from 2010, because then at that point there's a chance I have all the facts with me. Our revenue, on the other hand, has averaged 10 to 14, that particular range. So we are borrowing more than we are growing in revenue lately. There was a time when our borrowing was lower than our revenue. And as a country, part of why we have a problem with the second layer to this is now we are under the IMF. IDA is currently, in the past, I think 3-4 years, they are the highest creditors because we are in ICU. Okay, so we are in Trendville. All these are facts. By the time you go to the IMF, you're in ICU. So because we are in ICU, now we have to borrow from the World Bank and the IMF. Their conditionalities are raise more revenue. But our revenue has grown at a rate that is higher than our economic growth. So we do not have a problem of Kenyans paying tax. We have a problem of how the political class borrows, why they borrow. Last week, Monday, we were, this week has just been shocking reports of debt. We were attending another validation where the former governor of Laikipia was highlighting what the political economy, and I think, Kwame, you've also done similar analysis. Whenever we are about to get into an election, we borrow more. At that point, the Cabinet Secretary Treasury does not hold the same power. They are under direct orders. I must finish this legacy project so that I am re-elected. I must be remembered for. So this must be completed. So we borrow significantly more during those particular intervals. Now, when you have a president like Ruto, whose legacy must start day one, you borrow even more. Because he must leave a legacy of health, housing, agriculture, hustler, everything. But is that sustainable? No. And that is why we are now, it is Peter to pay Paul. I say we moved from SACCOs, we used to borrow from SACCOs. Well-negotiated bilateral loans, a bit of multilateral. We went to banks, so we went for all these Eurobonds and commercial banks. Now we are borrowing from Shylocks, the East, and so on at very high rates. What can civil society do? We've gone to Parliament. We've told them, you are ultimately, it doesn't matter that the report says there were pushbacks against Parliament approving. The architecture of our public finance, Parliament still holds the ultimate power. But Parliament is captured very easily because of one, CDF. And anybody who does not have CDF has been given GAF. And this is pegged on the annual budget. So there's every incentive for Parliament to make sure our budget is as high as possible. That way CDF increases and they also have their pocket money while the executive enjoys higher pocket money. So the problem of CDF and our debt remains very, very interlinked. But it has not stopped there. We are finalizing an analysis that shows there is a second, Treasury is one of the most powerful institutions, and I like to tell people I have worked more in human rights and governance than I have done the economy. And I used to think getting a hold of the CS, defense or interior is tough. Wait until you want to deal with Treasury. They know they are powerful, they wear their power everywhere. But when all the other MDAs are going to Treasury, they are very humble. Because if they say you will not spend, you will not spend. But a second cartel has been created in Parliament. Long-serving members of the Budget and Appropriation Committee, alongside members of the Finance and Planning Committee, have gotten ways of appropriating very, very high and new projects for their constituencies. So when the budget gets to them, they are not looking at it for our interests. And whether it means padding it so that their constituencies can be funded, they will stop at nothing. So Parliament understands its power, but it uses it negatively to our disadvantage. The Gen Zs, and let me say millennials so that I fit there, did us proud because they took all the analysis that had been produced by different civil society, think tanks, and demanded a reset. The Gen Zs just demanded a reset. And when they said reject the finance bill, it meant we are rejecting the revenue measures, but we are also rejecting this budget. Go back and let's check our priorities and so on. Unfortunately, both Parliament, the executive, And the party that was the leader of opposition, ODM, led a citizen coup of a process that would have allowed us to analyze all our loan liabilities, our budget and our priorities, and start working on the reset that Kwame is speaking to. Now, if you look at where we are with Parliament, with CBK, with the executive, to be honest, the only saving grace for our economy is the people and citizen. Unless Parliament gets significant pressure, not logic, people pressure to do the right thing, they will continue as they have done in the past week to pass things that do not work for our current status of being in ICU. The Gen Z protests were good because even the IMF that had ignored civil society for the last 2 years has come back to say, what were you saying? I think you were right. The governance issues could be the problem. Actually, we hope the government will ask for a governance diagnostic. When they do, we will believe you. So the government has asked for a governance diagnostic because they still require IMF, IFC, World Bank money. But they do not care one bit about reforming governance. So unless citizens and civil society come together, and then I can assure you the economic issues are tough. They are very complex. We are rarely able to speak to them in ways that get to the people. A very unique collaboration of technocrats in this area, people who are skilled in campaigns, and then Gen Zs on all their streets. We pressure government and we go back to what was intended when people are in bombers, where Parliament as a representative of the people, not of the president, are the ones that are determining how we budget, how we raise taxes, and how we acquire and utilize debt. So I'll pause there for now. Gladwell, thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that tour around some of the strategies that civil society uses. She talked about strategic litigation or public interest litigation, campaigns, etc. And of course, informing the public and the challenges of trying to do all this in the context that we are in Kenya, where we have blurred lines between the executive and the parliament, for example, with the infamous CD, Constituency Development Fund, for those of us who aren't Kenyans. So thank you very much for that. I think also Diana pointed out the challenges around, for example, borrowing binges around elections, and we'll come back to that later as we're closing, and including the intimidation of constitutional officers to approve expenditure which they knew was illegitimate. I think some of you will know what I'm referring to, the intimidation of the controller of budget. I'll now hand over to Wachira Maina to give us his remarks on the report, and after that we'll open the floor for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladwell. I am a teacher of law, so I'll go back to theory. It is not something that interests media in Kenya. Now, I want to ask three questions. And I want to try and answer the three of them. One of them is, what are the political sources of Kenya's debt problems? And number two, what are the constitutional sources? And number three, what is wrong with Kenya's budget institutions, and how do they contribute to Kenya's debt problem? Let's begin with the first question. What are the political sources? My argument is that it is time we started to situate this debt question in the political economy of Kenya. Kenya and Ethiopia are the only countries they are the only 2 countries in the top 10 African economies that are non-mineral economies. In fact, Kenya is Africa's largest non-mineral economy. Now, I want to distinguish the politics of mineral economies from the politics of non-mineral economies. Mineral economies are called rentier economies. They live off mineral rents. Economies that are not based on minerals are called merchant economies. They live off taxes. Now, the thing you need to know is the relationship between government policy and regime financiers. Who finances a regime for elections, and who votes for the regime, and how that influences the policy that the regime pursues. Kibaki was financed by people in the financial sector, banking, insurance, and he was voted for by a coalition of peasant farmers in Kenya, tea, sugarcane, coffee growers. Those are the people who voted for him. So Kibaki needed to reward both. So when he became president, he borrowed abroad, paid off the domestic debt, banks were awash with cash, and banks started lending to farmers. So the economy grew, because the people who funded Kibaki needed the economy to grow to make money. So the only way Kibaki coalition, the coalitional formation in the Kibaki presidency, the only way they could make money is if the economy grew. Fast forward, Uhuru takes over. He doesn't have the same connections in the financial, although they are big investors in that sector, but he himself as a person doesn't have the same presence that Kibaki has in this sector. So he relies a little bit on the Kibaki financiers and mobilizes Kibaki's voters. But he gets it into his head that he can outperform Kibaki. But remember that Kibaki's growth was steady, revenue-driven, modest revenue growth. In fact, the first 3 years of the Kibaki presidency were about sealing tax loopholes. That's how revenue went up. It wasn't actually additional collection. Additional collections are coming towards the end of his term. So Uhuru decides that he's going to outdo Kibaki, but he doesn't have the revenues to sustain outdoing Kibaki, so he borrows. Once he borrows, he goes into infrastructure spending, and the immediate beneficiaries of infrastructure spending are contractors. So in his second term, he's funded almost exclusively by contractors. What is the profile of a contractor? The profile of a contractor is a guy who wants the government to have projects, and he doesn't care whether the project is funded by debt or by taxes. So there isn't a real commitment in a contractor for the economy to grow. The economy, he just needs projects. So Uhuru's binge borrowing has to be understood as a response to his financiers. And it's the reason why Uhuru's dramatic response to his financiers in a context of an ongoing economy completely alienated the people who had voted for him in 2013. He was so incredibly unpopular towards the end of his term, he couldn't influence anybody in Mount Kenya. So this is the structure of the economy that William Ruto inherits. So he inherits an economy that has been borrowing. He mobilizes the anger of the people who are anti-Uhuru, so they vote for him. He makes reckless promises about his ability to deliver services. He inherits an economy that has no tax revenues. In fact, whose tax revenues have been on a steady decline year on year. If you look at the pattern of tax yield, is actually there is a secular decline in taxes from around 2017. And even when you get improvements, they are marginal. So he inherits this economy. It has no sources of growth. The only growth he can do is exactly what Uhuru did, which is to borrow more. But the headroom for borrowing is shrinking. So what does he do? And remember, he too was financed by contractors, because contractors thought they were going to get into the same gravy train of projects. So he finds himself without places to borrow cheaply. He turns to these new contracting frameworks. So government to government, oil deal, edible oils. What is he doing with these things? He's thinking, if I can get a mass market product that I can sell to many people in the country, it can earn a lot of profit for me. And if it is in a cornered market like edible oils, we'll be fine. So the regime looks for those sort of things, edible oils, government to government, Adani, And in fact, my prediction is, over the coming few years, a lot of public assets are going to be sold off through PPP. PPPs provide the following advantage. The project is going to be implemented by a private sector actor, and the government contribution might very well be giving sovereign guarantees for the loans to be borrowed by those private companies. Yeah, so I think that's how the 2027 election is going to be financed. Why is it important to understand this political economy? Because when we start saying that, when we, as Mwalimu did, say that we are on a debt treadmill, we are on a debt treadmill without political space for maneuver. So that's the first problem we have. There's no political space for maneuver because the constituency that William S. Ruto made reckless promises to has already defected from him. They're very angry. The voters have voted for him. So now it's become a regime exclusively responsive to potential financiers, not to voters. So the sources of growth, which might come from growing the economy, is not going to happen. Those are not deal makers who are interested in growing the economy. Or rather, growing the economy is a secondary objective to their making money. Okay? So that's the first thing I would like to say about some of the political sources of Kenya's debt problem. It is important to understand them because we can't even begin to address them and resolve the problem if we don't understand that. The second question is, what are the constitutional sources? The constitutional sources are technical, and I want you to understand this. The constitutional sources are technical. This country has not come to terms with the implications of a presidential system on the budget. Let me try and paint a picture for you. If you're in a parliamentary system, the way a parliamentary system works is that the party with the largest number of seats in parliament forms the government. So parliamentary system is a party system. Government is in parliament. Now, because it's a party system, the ruling party will lose power if it loses the confidence of parliament. Okay? Which means that the ruling party has a very great incentive to ensure that its party members stay loyal and that they vote for it all the time. So in a parliamentary system, budget decisions are actually made at the party level. They are made at the party level. So parliament comes to rubber stamp effectively. That's what the parliament does. The implication of it is that in a parliamentary system, time given to parliament for budget is very restricted. 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Okay? In a presidential system, parliament serves on a different electoral mandate from the president, because the president is directly elected and individual members of parliament are directly elected. And because the presidential system is not a party system, budget policy is negotiated on the floor of the House. Meaning that in a presidential system, the time available to discuss the budget is very long. In the US, it takes all of 6 months. Okay? So in Kenya, this is the problem. We have a budget system inherited from the parliamentary system, and we have a legislature designed to be one of the 3 organs in a presidential system. So what we have is a system that lacks all the strengths of a parliamentary system, which is widespread intra-party consultations, and has all the weaknesses of a presidential system, which is executive overreach. Okay? That is the architectural problem at the heart of the budget problem in Kenya. So you've got an executive which can borrow willy-nilly because parliament in its consideration of the budget comes hampered by the logic. You look at our standing orders. When the budget policy statement is put to parliament, parliament has 2 weeks to discuss it. When the budget review and outlook paper is brought to parliament, parliament has, I think, 3 weeks to discuss it. So the key budget documents on which government policy to borrow, government policy to spend, government policy to raise taxes, those key documents, the parliament has 2 weeks to debate, organize public participation, and approve them. 2 weeks. So the effect then has become that there really absolutely no time within which to discuss and to evaluate budget documents. So that's the second question that I'm trying to answer. The third question, what is wrong with Kenya's budget institutions? The first problem, the first thing that is wrong with Kenya's budget institution is we have a very fundamental misunderstanding of what a budget institution is. We think a budget institution is only the controller of budget, the Auditor General, and parliamentary committees. In fact, budget institutions include the Commission on Revenue Allocation, the Ethics and Corruption Commission, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Those are all budget institutions. And I'll show you in a minute why I'm calling them budget institutions. Let's begin, for example, with the CRA and talk about this in a little bit of depth. The CRA is a constitutional body established with the logic of what are called fiscal commissions in Europe. But it doesn't have the mandate of a fiscal commission. It's established in the constitution as almost like a fiscal commission, but it doesn't have the mandate of a fiscal commission. Meaning, it can't do the work that a fiscal commission would do, which is to provide general budget advice across government, across the institution of the executive and parliament. Its mandate is narrowed to issues related to devolution. We have a parliamentary budget office, which has many of the functions of fiscal commissions and fiscal councils. But again, its mandate is narrowly tailored to the interest of parliament. So you've got a CRA that has the standalone status, constitutional status of a fiscal commission in Europe, but it doesn't have the mandate of one. Then you have a parliamentary budget office that has many of the functions of fiscal councils and fiscal commissions in Europe, but its mandate is narrow. Okay? So neither of them is providing the advice that is required to be an effective budget institution. Okay? Then let's look at the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. The Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission reports to Parliament. Parliament has not understood that the reason why it reports is that when Parliament is reviewing spending by ministries, one of the things it ought to be considering is if the Auditor General has said that the Ministry of Labor has lost so much money, and the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission has said X and Y have stolen. The idea is supposed to be that you make a combination of those two reports and take an oversight action. So, but the Parliament doesn't understand it that way. It doesn't understand that these guys are not reporting to you. This is not a case of throwing confetti at a wedding. The more the merrier. It is not supposed to be working that way. This is supposed to be, these guys are reporting to you so you can act. Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. All those things you see in the Constitution about equity, inclusion, Article 43, right to health, right to education, whatever. These are budget obligations on the part of the government. So when the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights is reporting to Parliament, one of the things that when the Parliament is looking at the Controller of Budget's report, where the Controller of Budget is saying the county of Kisii is only spending 3% of its health budget. When they do that, Parliament is supposed to be saying, and we can see from the report of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights or Article 43, that in the last 3 years, Kisii has retrogressed in the provision of the right to health. So that because of this stunted understanding of the budget institutions and how budget institutions should be functioning in this country, we then have this completely cooked budget system that is not able to deal with the actual needs of the people of Kenya. So those three things. The political economy explains why we are on the treadmill. The constitutional question tells us why Parliament is ineffective. The budget institution tells us why budget policy is not on track. So if you were to summarize this, I would summarize it this way. I would say the failures of the Kenya public debt system. One, we have ended up with unaccountable loans, both domestic and external. And they are unaccountable in a very perverse way. You see, the government always brings debt ceilings to Parliament for approval, and then treats the approval of debt ceiling as an approval of a loan. In other words, the government treats the approval of a capacity as parliamentary commitment to borrow. Okay, because enhancing the borrowing power merely creates capacity to borrow. It does not authorize the actual borrowing. Okay? Now, there is a problem, because debt ceilings may be approved. If you remember that debt in Kenya is a direct charge on the consolidated fund, then this is what you end up with. You end up with a ceiling that was approved, a borrowing that was made on the basis of the approved ceiling, but not on basis of authorization. Then that debt is a fast charge on the consolidated fund, which means that Parliament never has an opportunity, which they would have if this money was being appropriated, to discuss that debt. So the debt was never discussed at approval because a capacity was what was approved. It is not discussed at appropriation because debt is a direct charge on the consolidated fund. Okay? That's number one. Number two, when you borrow for current consumption, as the government has been doing, not only do you violate the Constitution's prudential requirements, but also you violate the Constitution's commitment to intergenerational equity. Because the point is this: debt is deferred taxation. Debt is not paid from current revenues. Debt is paid from future revenues. So if you take it that not taxation without representation, you are taxing people who are not represented. The future isn't represented. You are taxing people who are not represented and conferring no benefits on them. Yeah? Because the only justification for borrowing is you borrow, build a school, the future will inherit a school which gives them services and some debt which they can pay. So you burden them, but you also give them benefits. But if you are borrowing for consumption, you are giving them no benefit, except environmental destruction, because the more you consume, the more impact you have on the environment. Number three, again, now summarizing the debt problems, the structural debt problem for Kenya, the government disclosures to Parliament are not only weak, they have been incomplete, and very many times they've been deceptive. And I don't want to go through all the deceptions. I have unearthed some of those deceptions in some work I did earlier. Four, because the executive understands that these oversight institutions have been mentioning and calling budget institutions, because the executive understands that those institutions are very central to accountability, those institutions have been chronically not only underfunded, but defunded. Not underfunded, defunded. So if you think about the Commission on Revenue Allocation, sometimes we even defunded the judiciary. If you think about the controller of budget, you think about the Auditor General. Well, the Auditor General wanted to go to the US to audit the Eurobond money that got lost. Not only was he insulted by the president, but in fact the following year, the budget of that office was reduced. And then there is a point that Kwame made about record keeping. And I think that I don't need to, do not need to emphasize. I think one of the issues that we have not really come to terms with is the fact that this expensive Eurobond that was issued in a panic, and then with the triumphalism at the beginning of the year, most of it was going to pay the Eurobond that was lost in 2014. So basically, we have double obligation. We've borrowed an expensive loan to pay a loan that was stolen. So in a nutshell, I would think these are the core problems of the Kenya debt problem. And what Walibu is saying with this China debt treadmill, and I think this is where I wanted to come and end this discussion. The pressure, for the reasons I've mentioned, constitutional, political, and institutional, the pressure is not going to lessen. It's going to increase. And being so dependent, first of all, China debt is new and it's very big. So the vulnerability of Kenya to fiscal pressure from China is going to be very huge. I don't quite agree with my friend Kwame that China doesn't have a grand debt strategy. It does. Because, and then this is the last point I want to make. You need to understand where China is coming from on this question. China, geopolitically speaking, China's greatest weakness and vulnerability is its security weakness vis-a-vis American naval power. Obama's idea of pivoting to the South China Sea was basically to barricade China, strategically speaking. And it was the immediate trigger for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Because the Belt and Road Initiative is China's strategy for nullifying American naval power. China has built railway lines across the Eurasian continent. It can get goods to Germany by train in 21 days. It takes a ship 28 days. Because if you think about the sea route from China to Europe, you get to Indonesia, the Straits of Malacca, very narrow. If America positions itself there militarily, problems for China. Oil from the Gulf, Straits of Hormuz, very narrow. Entry to the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, Djibouti, very narrow. Suez Canal, very narrow. And Straits of Gibraltar, very narrow. The sea routes to Europe, China's largest market, are so vulnerable to American naval power that China did Belt and Road basically to cohere a whole set of countries. I think they began with 65 countries. To cohere all these 65 countries to its economy. The same way America did the Marshall Plan to align Europe with American interest. So there is a grand strategy. It's just not a grand strategy about Kenya. It's a global strategy. But Kenya is part of that cog of that Chinese strategy. And I think it's important that we appreciate that. So that now, if you are China and Kenya owes you all this money, you want to keep them on the trip as long as you can, partly to outflank America, but also partly to keep them on the Straits of Narrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wachira, for that discussion around the political economy of debt, the constitutional implications, the fiscal constitutionalism implications, and also the geostrategic elements of China's strategy towards the world, really, and Africa broadly. We'll open the floor for questions, interventions. We're running behind time, but still I think we can take at least half an hour, depending on the interest. So we would invite you to feel free to put questions to any of the panelists and to the author of the report. When you do pose a question, please introduce yourself with your name and organizational affiliation, yeah? Or your comments.
Thank you very much, Mwalimati, and the panel for your contributions. I think my name is Leonard Wanyama. I'm the regional coordinator of the East African Tax and Governance Network, and I found the presentations are very enlightening. I think to tie the responses from Diana and Wachira Maina, especially since we work together with Diana under the Okoa Uchumi Coalition. There is a case going forward in our public finance management to, whether it is intellectually or otherwise, figure out a way to, for lack of a better word, or just being direct, punish Parliament. And hold their feet to the fire. Because when I listen particularly to what you've just presented, I see we are in a state of, over the past 10 years, a situation where the government or administrations are being formed on a basis of a corruption bargain. That you mobilize in a way such that you are not against the law per se, but you're not doing illegal things, but your actions are actually against the spirit of the constitutions and the law in place. So much so that even as you look at it in terms of the deals or whatever, even on the short-term basis, political actions have a very direct consequence to public finance management and how it is carried out. Two cases, just before I close. I would postulate, for instance, that the impeachment of the deputy president is a corruption bargain between the executive and parliament, so that you have the IEBC suspended and then you can continue with the regular public finance management. Or the tyranny of numbers was an operational plan for how parliament would then go into these laws. So hence my treatise that there is a way we have to think about punishing parliament, because at this time, even as NCCK is calling for a recall, we can't do that because the IEBC is suspended. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take further questions. And I hope you're noting anything which you want to comment on or answer.
Thank you very much. My name is John Kamande from Uraia Trust, and I'm very intrigued by the report, and I want to really appreciate Mwalimu Mati for the insightful analysis into this issue. Sitting here, I was almost at the edge of my seat because at Uraia we are really committed to civic education, and one of the sectors that has been really challenging to unpack is public debt. So I'll be listening, and I'm glad that most of the discussants have mentioned the need for us to work together as civil society to be able to see how well we can be able to package this information to citizens, because this is really needed. And it's amazing to see how Mwalimu has been able to get all this information, because most Kenyans struggle to understand or to get sources where they can infer. And as Diana mentioned, we need to sustain the press for citizens. And how are we going to do this? Is through civic education, both, of course, conventional ways and ways we used to do before. Secondly, I don't know what the discussants and the author feel about the recent trend we are seeing with government in moving towards public-private partnerships in financing special capital projects. We are seeing a very, very increasing trend in terms of lobbying for public-private partnerships to finance capital projects, as even as recent as yesterday, where we're seeing the president, of course, trying to mention something close to that. I don't know what's their take about it. Second, the issue of government's commitment, and I take note of the transitions in the regimes that have affected, and the analogy and the explanation from Washira with regard to the regime funding. I don't know how that's going to affect it. We saw early this year, or this year, the president even constituting a task force to analyze the public debt situation in Kenya, which I don't know how far it is. Probably Mwalimu or any of the discussants who are privy to this, it might tell us how appropriate was that, or how did that go? Because it seemed he was coming from a position of not being very, very aware of the situation at hand. And I'm glad that that turned out how it turned out. And then, of course, the last thing is, I was so that the 16 projects that they funded probably were stolen, and they keep giving money for the same. What is really the interest? Yeah? And so these are things that I'll be very glad to hear insights from the discussants or any of the participants from the room. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Aoko from the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. I have 2 or 3 questions. I'm curious to know if maybe Mwalimu had gone into looking into the effects or impact of some of these large infrastructural projects whose funding came from this public debt. For example, he mentioned the Thika Road. Are there any statistics or data to show the impact that, you know, the government on their side say that these investments are going to claw back benefits in the future? And even Mr. Kwame did talk about also some of like the Silicon Savannah, perhaps looking at the future, the long-term effect. What is the long-term effect of some of these large infrastructural projects? And also, is anyone like actively lobbying for specific anchors to safeguard against the runaway borrowing, even if it's Parliament? Is there any specific action, even anchored in law, that will help us guide parliamentarians away, rather than just like in activism terms? I don't know if you understand what I mean, but in law or legislation, because they come back to you and say, no, is this in law? It's not in law, so we'll do this. Is there any specific action that is being taken from by yourselves to actually claw back this, roll back this adverse effects we're having due to this public debt situation? Thank you.
Well, I think the only one that was directed to me was from Alan of KBC. Well, I didn't mention Thika Road. That was the first thing. But in terms of the impact of the public projects that are financed by debt, any debt, well, so long as we actually get, for example, the highway, then we are taking some benefit. So long as it's properly built, so long as it's improving market access. I was concerned, for example, about the SGR, which is built, it doesn't begin in Mombasa at the harbor and does not terminate in Nairibi. It terminates in Machakos, and then it terminates again in the middle of the Rift Valley, and not even at Naivasha. It's at a place called Dukamoja. So this is my concern, that obviously we've at least gained the infrastructure, but is it tied into our network properly so that we can actually get economic benefits from it? But the other real question is, if it was an ideal situation, we would have had a discussion as a country about how much we're borrowing, how much we can afford to borrow at this particular time. As Washira was saying, this could be like a 6-month discussion before we pass a debt-financed or deficit-financed budget. So we're talking about greater transparency, greater participation of the people, greater consideration of what is the purpose of development. As we're talking about Article 43, improved citizenry, better health, education, standards of life for the Kenyan people. That's what we borrow money for. But if we're borrowing for shiny new toys, then we're making a mistake. And ultimately, I also pointed out that there are some projects for which we have borrowed multiple times, and to date, they've never been completed. So if you recall, the Eurobond of 2014, 10 years ago, which we've recently borrowed money to repay, the investors' prospectus said it was inter alia to rebuild Jomo Kenyatta Airport. Never been done. So this is what we call the betrayal of those who have executive power and those who are meant to watchdog the executive. I think that was my only response.
Yeah, let me respond to this question about impact of infrastructure projects. I think it is really important to understand what's going on with this, you put it on my papers, to understand what's going on with this borrowing. You see, when the government borrows to build infrastructure and the investors don't follow and invest, if the investors don't invest after you build the infrastructure, the economy will record growth, yeah? Because you have acquired a new capital asset that you didn't have before, okay? It's like you build a house, but you don't get tenants, okay? In your books, there will be an asset called a house, but it doesn't have an income stream. So the crisis we have in Kenya, the real crisis I'm talking about impact, is that the economy has been growing, but because investors are not investing, it's not creating jobs. So we've had jobless growth. That's why we've had a jobless growth for nearly 30 years, okay? The Gen Z crisis is a reflection of the fact that you have an economy that is growing and which we talk about, but it's not creating jobs for them. In fact, the formal economy creates about 200,000 jobs every year, and we are releasing about 1 million people to the job market every year, okay? I mean, if you think about the quality of the people we are releasing to the job market, the people who entered school with Kibaki's free education in 2003, the first cohort graduated from university in 2018. There has been how many cohorts since then? 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and now this 2024. 7. These are people with university education, okay? Youth unemployment is 35%. The national unemployment is 10%, apparently, according to the numbers that I have seen, and Kwame might have better numbers than I do. But youth unemployment is outsize of that unemployment number, okay? So there is impact, but it's very negative impact because we have adopted a model of what I call development as a spectacle, yeah? So this idea that you want to fund something that is spectacular, visible. You see, politicians, the things that cause development in a country, by the way, is software, it's education, it's health, the things that actually lead to growth. Because DRC has a lot of mineral resources, but it's a very poorly educated human resource. Yeah? So the minerals are useless. Hong Kong is a rock in the ocean, yeah, but it's got a highly educated population. Yeah? So it is developed. People don't develop, minerals don't develop countries. Okay. So if you come and build big conference centers and build big railway lines and big whatever, you're not growing the economy. You are building a stock of capital, yes, physical capital, but that's not growing the economy. So yes, there's an impact, but not necessarily the sort of impact that maybe you're looking for. That's number one. Number two, this question about recent trends in PPP, I thought I had kind of made reference to that a little bit. I think you need to understand where the government is going with PPP. The government is no longer a premium borrower, okay? It is such a heavily indebted government. It's like, imagine you are yourself on the following position. You have 3 credit cards which you have maxed out. You have a mortgage that is 2 months in arrears. You have a car loan that you're having problem servicing. Then you go back to the market to borrow. Very few people will lend you money. The government of Kenya is in that situation. PPP is very attractive to a government like that because you get a private guy who comes and is prepared either to risk their own money or to go and borrow abroad. But the only way this private guy is going to borrow abroad is if he or she gets a sovereign guarantee from the government. Yeah? So finally he has something the government can give. Yeah? A sovereign guarantee. And in fact, this Kerio Valley nonsense we were talking about with you the other day, is exactly what happened. Aurora Kimarel thing is exactly what happened. That you have a contractor who is saying they are going to borrow, and the government is giving a guarantee. So PPPs are very attractive Because whoever we invite here, who will say they want to invest in Kenya, they will just tell the government, by the way, we are going to HSBC and we are going to borrow $2 billion, $3 billion. Please give us a sovereign guarantee. And this is a public-private partnership. Your partnership, your contribution to the partnership is the sovereign guarantee. Okay. So we are going to see more of it. That's the prediction I was making. We are going to see more of this stuff as we go towards 2027, because that's going to be the source of money.
Great.
Okay, well, yes, I think the question of PPPs has been answered. The impact on large infrastructure projects has also been answered, in the sense that obviously the contractors made money, but it did not generate growth or revenues. So for instance, I'll give the example of the SGR. Of all things about the SGR, completed in 2017, just in time for the elections. And of course, you know the debt. In addition to that, there's apart from the construction alone, the management fees for the standard gauge railway is the equivalent of $100 million the equivalent of $1 billion shillings per month, $10 million per month. About 3 weeks ago, well, maybe 2 months ago, you saw that the SGR could not pay for itself, right? And it's telling you that in all those 6 years in which the SGR has run, the amount of money that was received from all the revenues could not even pay the management fees alone. Do you guys get that? You can't even pay the management fees alone. Forget about servicing the debt. And obviously that's how comes the debt has been brought back this side. But whoever it is who constructed got one contract or the other from the SGR made a lot of money, including the company that's taking the management fees and all that. So that's the effect. When you have a responsible infrastructure investment, such as what these represent, whether it's because you're funding elections or just basically providing contractors with an opportunity to earn money, that's the result. And the burden and the liability lies with government of Kenya. I'll give another example. The last mile, you remember when President Uhuru and his deputy were going around huts in Kenya fixing power lines? We are fixing lights. And we had debates with some people in civil society who were my peers, and we had completely different views. But the thing that actually blew it for me was I looked at KPLC's data, because what government was doing was borrowing, establishing those lines, and then putting the liability on KPLC's lines. And in that 1 year when the elections took place, they connected an additional 1.7 or 1.8 million people, new households. After the first month, 700,000 people did not even pay the first bill. Do you understand what that means? Yeah. You connect power, 40% of the people you've connected the new power to do not even pay the first month's bill. What does that tell you? Either they don't need it or they couldn't afford it. However, a liability exists because once you've connected transformers and all those other things, remember the transformers that were being supplied? That liability exists, and that liability was dumped on KPLC. And that's part of the reason why its balance sheet has also always been in trouble. So these are the connections. So these things do not have, it's not just money disappearing into the air. It actually generates other inefficiencies which are reproduced in the balance sheets of KPLC, and you can see now Kenya Railways and that. Yes, bad infrastructure development for whatever purpose creates that. And that's why for us, I keep insisting, regardless of the dysfunction that exists in the constitutional infrastructure, right? I'm tying it up to what specific guide Parliament needs to do its job. Because these things were not necessarily sneaked through it. The information wasn't necessarily available, but parliamentarians were themselves being given lists about how many people in each of their constituencies were connected to the power lines. So bad infrastructure, and actually it's that, yes, development theater, or as, I'll be taking that and using it, development as spectacle. I think that, yes, shiny, swanky things as a replacement for real development and welfare, without asking what the welfare effects are. So that's it. Thanks. And when someone goes to it's still continuing. The president goes to Japan and sees that fantastic, you all know, to the Shinkansen, right? That very fast train. And then he comes back here and says, Japan does that because they are 40% of GDP tax to GDP. So let's come and raise our GDP so we can do one like that. You know, that kind of envy, train envy. Fantastic. He has this obsession with big things. But that's it. It's going to continue in terms of bad borrowing. Somebody will come
And I can tell you globally, if you want to construct a Shinkansen, somebody will do it for you through a PPP arrangement in which they dump the liability on government as well. Somebody will do it. Thanks.
Sorry. Wow. Thank you. Allow me to respond to just a few things. And I think on public-private partnerships, there's already attempts to go back to the amendments that have been made so that all partnerships go back to Parliament for approval. Before then, they can be signed. But for some reason, other than the recent procurement amendments, where we have seen Parliament attempt, I am not sure. To be honest, the amendments that were passed were presented last week by the Finance and Planning Committee around procurement, ensuring Kenyans get most of the contracts, requirement for certain contracts to go to Parliament, a level of openness, ensuring we lock the entire procurement process on the portal. That way it's easier to have aspects of accountability and transparency. Those ones are commendable, but one of the few that have happened, because in the privatization process, Parliament had ceded its powers to provide oversight and left it all to Cabinet and the executive. So when you think about Parliament, it's not just activism. First, Article 203 on how we share equitable revenue requires that the first thing is national interest. Economists, and maybe Washira, you can respond to this at some point. They say the first charge is the consolidated, is the public debt and consolidated fund services. But when we drafted our constitution, just in the manner of how we ranked national interests. We've never enacted any budget that speaks to that particular provision of the constitution. Why have we set it aside? And then secondly, 206 and 211. Like, there is no even doubt. This is not where lawyers are saying the law is very clear. It is actually just black and white. It is the mandate and responsibility of Parliament. Based on what has happened in the political economy, Parliament and the entire political class know they're in trouble with the people. Because this is no longer 2016, where a few experts would say we are in trouble because of debt. We all know we are in trouble because of debt. That is why they will not set up the IEBC. Because if Wanyama says we punish Parliament, we know how to punish them. And the Constitution has created mechanisms for that. So around that particular process, it's very clear. Finally, why is it okay for China to keep lending more money, yet it knows that is money it had given, and top it up? In this room, I see people who are involved in Golden Bag, Anglo leasing, which is all about repaying debt and repaying debt and repaying debt invoices that have already been paid, because it's nobody follows. Nobody follows. When you steal tax twice, we will go to KRA, we'll trace it. We trace tax revenue better than we trace debt revenue. China invests in intelligence. And after all, they are not writing off the debt. It is more debt. You want us to fund your bad manners of stealing? We will fund it again. And say, unlike other countries where we can then petition their civil society to go to court, what do we do for China? It works for both the political class of China and the political class of Kenya. We are on our own. The debt is not government debt, it is our tax. It is us who will pay back.
Thank you very much, Diana. And concluding with pointing out that bitter situation where you'll remember Uhuru telling us we must pay for Anglo leasing so that he can go out and borrow Eurobond, which itself was stolen. So we're caught on a treadmill of paying for corruption. We'll go to the next round. There's the gentleman in the brown shirt at the back had his hand up, and Sam Mwaura has his hand up.
My name is Sikula Onyala from, sorry? Okay. My name is Sikula Onyala from Amnesty International. I'm intrigued by one thing that Mwalimu Mati mentioned in the report about Kenya's inability, one of the conditionalities that was placed in the SGR agreement, that Kenya was not to, voice concerns around human rights and governance issues. I don't know whether this was just on China or generally. And then the lack of politicization of the Human Rights Council. And my questions around this, was this a way of, China buying Kenya's silence at the global stages? Are we seeing a trend, maybe since the SGR agreement was signed, in terms of how Kenya has been voting at the Human Rights Council, at the UN Security Council, and generally, maybe as Gladwell said, this is a report that is likely, it's a series, we have a series of reports coming up. Maybe if this is a thread that can also be taken up, trying to understand how many of these African countries, now that AfriCOG works across the continent, how China's loans have actually turned their voting at some of these global human rights arenas. And maybe last week I was at a conference where someone from the Interparliamentary Alliance on China actually said on the eve of their conference last year in, I think, Taiwan or Bangkok, the Chinese government petitioned Kenya government and many other poor African countries not to allow their members of parliament to attend this particular summit. And based on what you've just said, Mwalimu, I wonder whether this is a result of what went into the SGR agreement, and whether actually many of these agreements that Kenya has been signing with, loan agreements that Kenya has been signing with China, this particular provision exists in those agreements. Thanks.
My name is Sam Mwaura from the Private Sector Development Trust, and I represent the private sector in this conversation. There are a number of things that we can do to help ourselves. And first of all, I would like to congratulate AfriCOG and Mwalimu Mati for an excellent report. I think the kind of report we have received is absolutely world class. The problem that I see is that if we were to end this job with the report, even with the dissemination through the media, we will have very, very little impact. Citizens are now more aware of the problems that face the country and are now willing to engage in the advocacy for these issues. And my request number one is whether AfriCOG and the civil society in general would agree to now partner with the citizens and religious organizations to progress this item and this agenda to its logical advocacy conclusion. Secondly, we are aware that the problem we have with public debt is that majority of it has been borrowed outside the law. In other words, the borrowing did not comply with the law. The law is very clear that you borrow for development expenditure only. Secondly, that the repayment of the debt, both the capital and interest, becomes part of the recurrent expenditure. Thirdly, that you borrow for specific projects, and those projects are secured in the Budget and Appropriation Act. And then finally, the amount you borrow for a specific project is ring-fenced, that it can only be expensed to implement that project. So if that process, which is very clearly laid out in law, was complied with, we wouldn't have this problem of debt. And therefore, our request, number 2, is that now we advocate very specifically for government to stop borrowing any more money that does not comply with the law. So even as we try and grapple with what to do with the huge amounts that have accumulated as debt, let us not make the situation worse by continuing to borrow illegally. And that is something we can do by taking it up as an advocacy, a specific advocacy agenda. Now, number 3 is for us to insist that the PPP projects are actually treated like loans to government, because the minute you issue sovereign guarantee, that is a contingent liability that is taken on by government, and therefore is a loan and should be subject to the same clearance process and scrutiny by citizens through public participation. And then finally, we should recognize that our number 1 priority in this country at the moment in terms of governance is IEBC, or lack of a properly constituted IEBC. The government had committed to constitute IEBC within 14 days in response to the pressure from Gen Zs. Now it is months and it has not been done. And therefore we should now take it as one of the priority advocacy items. And I see today's gathering being a launching pad to progress in the direction that we are now proposing, if it can be accepted. And I'm convinced that if we do that, we will create impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for those closing points.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I will speak, then I would leave. No disrespect, because I'm just running for too many other engagements. So the first thing is really to commend the effort that has gone into this excellent work. Sometimes we forget, because Mwalimu was talking to me privately, whispering, it's like he's feeling butterflies because he hasn't presented for a long time. I'm like, why would you feel butterflies? Mwalimu, the work that is represented here shows a long-standing tradition of excellence that is also unfailing, and I would like to commend that, because it's with this level of excellence we're able to lift the national debate. And I think in this gathering we've done so one more time, and we've done this so many times before. What this country needs is sort of an intellectual anchoring to save it from the implied disaster that the moment we are in represents. And my only regret is that we didn't have the size of audience that the excellent work that went into this report probably deserves. And I was talking to Diana during the break, and Sam as well. There will be commitment to ensure that the other levels of interest, exposure to this report are generated in the coming days. This part that Sam talked about is also getting this information to the population out there. I think this message is necessary, and I hope that as part of the follow-up, we are going to reconvene and work together towards finding ways to get this message to the population so that they can also use it for their own activity. The second point I was going to make is Diana, we were in DC recently, and Diana organized for a meeting, for a dinner with the new CS for Treasury Mbadi, and it was a good conversation. There are many things that he said, but one of those was around how he sees himself in this moment. I think he sees the IMF World Bank as more responsive and more listening, blah, blah, blah. But it's the attribution of that was, for me, confounding. I think he thinks that it has to do with himself, his new. So there's a way he speaks, the way he conducts himself. Makes them kind of more responsive than has been the case. And I told him, it's not you, it's Gen Z. The IMF is responding to Gen Z. They know there's a new marshal in town, and that marshal is above IMF, it's above Treasury. So it's really to make the point, how do we, as part of going to the population, how do we link this kind of information with that part of the population that has brought a new way of looking at the same information that represents a certain potency that we've not had before. The third point is, the third and last, is Uhuru Kenyatta arrives in 2013 and presents the country with an Ozymandias moment. You remember that poem by B.P. Shelley? My name is Ozymandias. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Yeah. And the way he does that is by all these projects and this thing. And Ruto is a continuation of Ozymandias. But why do leaders go into feel compelled to become Ozymandias? It is because they have come to office with a legitimacy crisis. And that legitimacy crisis, they feel they can compensate for it by giving you spectacle. And what I'm making with this is that there's a link between elections, because elections confer political legitimacy, and what we regard as development, the things that we care about ourselves. Both Kenyatta served for 10 years without ever getting political legitimacy, and the people who now say Uhuru Kenyatta was this, it's completely revisionist, because Uhuru never enjoyed political legitimacy from the country for even one day for the 10 years. Ruto arrives exactly hobbled exactly by the same problems, and feeling that he needs to give you toys as a way of recovering some legitimacy. So these conversations have got to be linked with elections and the fact that elections do matter, and how people arrive in office is tied to how they govern, and is tied to how they feel a need to give you spectacle as a way of winning some legitimacy, and that spectacle then leaves you in this problem of debt that we are now dealing with. What Ruto will keep doing, and what is Ruto's language with the population? tumetenga, that tutafanya, that is what he goes with. He has to go with that because he's saying to the population, I'm doing these things for you. How can there be a problem with me? How can there be, please accept me. It's a sugar daddy, thing. I'll give you this, I can do this, I can fly you to Malaysia. So elections do matter, and they've got to be linked to this conversation, and that's the only point I'm making. And thank you again very much for your excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Gladwell, for being ever so green in the way that you managed to bring these coalitions of actors together. Thank you.
My name is James Kinyo from Transparency International Kenya, and I'm glad my predecessor has just spoken before me, because I was also trying to link this conversation to the issue of Finance Campaigning Act, implementation of it, as well as the implementation of the Political Parties Act, because I think from all that we have discussed, the main problem that we have is a governance issue that gets to spill over to become a fiscal issue. So probably even as we carry out our advocacy and all this, maybe we need to link all these conversations into the Campaign Financing Act, so that we curb the factors that Mr. Wachira was talking about in terms of regimes and how they operate, as well as manage our political parties, because one way or another they have an influence in the governance process and implementation of projects.
I'm Adan Ibrahim from KBC. My question is to Mr. Mwalimu and Mr. Wachira. We have seen you have give us a very unique report, but can you give us a solution to this problem that we have? Is it about the integrity, ethics, and honesty? What does this institution are lacking? Because I can see you have more details. You have that more consultation with the citizens, and you have more information. What do you think is a solution that, because issue of the election has passed, but now what you want is the service. Where are these institutions are lacking? Even including the parliament, can you give us a guidance? What should be done so that they can be able to focus on the service delivery of the citizens? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We come back to the panel, and Kwame, if there's anything you'd like to respond to, because Kwame does have to leave us. So, you have anything? Okay, thank you. Does, I think the direct questions were addressed to
Okay. Yeah, thanks. What had I just written? I think, what solutions? First of all, I think I would like to discourage us from getting to solution mode all the time. Because I think part of the problem with this administration is being in solution mode without understanding the problem. So that the kind of things that the president commits to before he has thought through what requires to be done is actually the reason for the crisis. Because the solution to William Ruto's problems is trust. But he has no incentive to cultivate trust. Because cultivating trust will require him doing a bit of committing political suicide. Because he would have to behead quite a lot of the people near him, literally. He's got to get rid of them, yeah? Because the public won't believe the things he's doing unless they see that some of the people who the public blames for the things that have gone wrong are not in administration, and that they've been replaced by people who the public can trust. So, because trust is the most important political asset any political leader has. So long as the system has a trust deficit, it is any technical solution we propose here. I train people on implementing policy change. And one of these I tell them, policy is not technical. In fact, failure of a policy because of technical reasons happens in very limited circumstances. Policy fails mostly for political reasons because policy creates winners and losers. Now, in a regime like this, where the economic situation is very weak, the government's capacity to choose winners is very high. That's really the problem. And so long as those winners are also going to finance the candidate in 2027, the candidate has no incentive whatsoever to create the kind of trust that would then be necessary to create reform. So that's the first thing, that we are like, we are drug addicted political system. So the second thing I want to say is, I am very ambivalent about IMF funding. Not because of the conditions, like most people are usually saying IMF conditions. I don't mind IMF conditions. If a debt drunk somebody comes to you, I think they deserve to have conditions imposed on them. But that's one of the reasons what worries me about IMF debt. It is the problem of fungibility. If you give government that is badly behaved money from IMF, any other money that the government had earned from something else, say from taxes, it can then spend it on the things that you don't want it to spend on. So that although the IMF money is spent nicely, the fact that you have the IMF money frees other money makes it's actually possible to increase corruption with IMF funding. Because the government won't steal IMF money, but it will steal the other money that it gets from other sources. Yeah? So I think that's where the problem really lies for me, because what you need is a systemic view, but you don't get systemic views. Thank you.
I think Bwana Adan from KBC, as he has said, the solutions lie in us doing our bit to do more than just sort of, they call it admiring the problem. Now we need to actually understand that it's actually a shared collective problem, and then to work, as Sam and other colleagues have said, to be determined about enforcing laws which are already on the books, but beyond that, actually to lobbying. And I suppose with a view to, if this parliament is as bad as we think it is, then what we need to do is to be looking at what is the next parliament going to look like. So there's an obligation to step up, but be realistic. It is what it is. This report does not change the debt appetite of this current administration. We've got to do far more to convince voters that the debt policy of a candidate is important, or of a political party, or even their intentions. Those are things to interrogate. Then finally, just on the Amnesty International colleague's question, in the report, it's actually cited. This conditionality is from the Beijing Declaration of FOCAC. So you'll find it on page 12. So it's not about the SDR. It was signed on to by every African country that attended that conference. And essentially, Africa agreed to vote as a bloc on those two issues. The Human Rights Council, and or the Human Rights Agenda, and on the reunification of China. Personally, I mean, if you're to ask me, I don't have a problem with the reunification of China. Yeah? But I do think that it's a bit careless for our government to pledge in advance how it is going to vote on human rights issues, particularly a month before we joined the Human Rights Council. So I think that is the issue on human rights.
In any case, if Taiwan is interested in joining China, I mean, we don't know whether we know they are not.
They're not. I see a very decisive head shake in the audience. They're not. You're from Taiwan. Yes. So we don't want to be cavalier about very deeply felt and held beliefs. Thank you so much. Were there any questions there? Okay, so I think what we shall do now, thank you so much for the questions and the responses. I think it's been such a wide-ranging debate, but it certainly circles around certain perennial issues which come again and again and again. And I think after all the technical information, after all the numbers, it was really important to be reminded that it boils down to some very simple things which we don't think are very clever or, you know, have much to do with policy. What Washira said, trust. Yeah? Trust is the most important political asset any leader can have. And the people do not trust this government. And indeed, they have absolutely no reason to do so. I think we will do, you know, at least the little photo op with the reports and hand them out to you. But before we do that, we've covered a lot of issues which are going to come up again in the next event which we're planning, which is planned for Monday, the 9th of December, and it's a launch of our latest report on corruption, which is going to look at corruption under the first 2 years of the Ruto government. We'll cover a bit of the waning months of the Uhuru Kenyatta government, because we've seen the continuities between the governments in terms of its economic malfeasance and the drug addiction that it has, as Washira called it, you know, the addiction to debt. So this report is called Wrong Direction and is an assessment of Ruto's first two years. Very eventful and very, very difficult to keep track of with, you know, daily developments. But we invite you to that because you'll see, again, as we were focusing on the political economy basis of the sort of decisions the government is making, they're not insane. They have there's a political logic behind the decisions that they are making, and they're doing so because they can. So the questions raised, for example, by Sam and others about what we're going to do about it. Yes, let's study the issues, and as our contribution, we will keep this analysis going, and we will keep on contributing to the public debate, collaborating with our colleagues, and thank you very much for the commitment to help us disseminate the report even further. For now, what we'll do is, traditionally, I think the press likes to have us standing and holding copies of the photograph of the report. So while we're doing that, the rest of you will be handed your own copy to take with you as you leave. Thank you very much. And then after the launch, we'll do the closing and vote of thanks, and then we invite you to a meal with us. Thank you. So let's do this quickly. Yeah, I don't know. He'll tell us. Yeah, I think. Let's take Tita. Yeah, can we get the AfriCOG, the other one, the other AfriCOG banner, that one and that one, and move this one away. Thank you, madam. Yeah. And we do have lunch, so you're welcome to stay for lunch.
The launch is here. The launch for the Monday one.
Excuse me, everyone. I should have added the launch of the corruption report, Wrong Direction, is on Monday 9th at Ufungamano, which is on Mamlaka Road near the university. And it's at the same, what time is it from? From 9 until midday. So you're welcome to that. And it's a public forum, so you can bring people along with you. Yeah. Okay. Mwalimu, sorry. 3. We need 3. Diana, do you want to be in the picture? Yeah. You have to hold a...
Mwalimu in the middle.
Yeah.
Give me a copy.
Yeah. Yeah. Mwalimu in the middle. Mwalimu has to be in the middle. Yeah, you have to be in the middle. It's your report.
I need light. See, I'm down.
Oh, look up. Hold it.
Look here, madam. Look here. Okay.
No, surely you can cut that.
Yeah.
Cut that from.
Yeah, we feel like performing monkeys.
Just say launch.
No, we're very happy to launch this new report called Kenya's Debt Treadmill, the China Portfolio. And we hope that you'll be able to download it from our website at www.africog.org. And some of you will obviously get physical copies. So you're very welcome to read it, and we welcome your feedback and your comments and your engagement. And once again, remember on December 9th, Monday, we are launching our newest anti-corruption report, which examines corruption under the first 2 years of the William Ruto government at Ufungamano House from 9 o'clock on Monday morning, 9th of December, which is International Anti-Corruption Day. Thank you very much.
So we want one image. So let me hold this for you.
Let me also hold this.
That's how we want it. Yes,
Where's the lunch? Yes, please, is lunch is ready. Lunch is served. Please, please go and serve yourself some lunch. Thank you very much.